Picture this. It's late afternoon in Gaul. Somewhere around 50 BC, a Roman legion has just completed a grueling 20-mile march since dawn. The men are utterly spent. Their feet are raw. Their shoulders ache from carrying 60-pound packs, and every muscle screams for rest. But as the cornicent sounds the halt with a long, unmistakable blast, something extraordinary happens. 6,000 exhausted soldiers don't collapse where they stand. They don't sit down to catch their breath. Instead, they immediately begin constructing a fully engineered, fortified military installation from scratch. I'm talking about earthen ramparts, defensive ditches, watchtowers, a main street, a command headquarters, a hospital, organized barracks, water supply systems, and everything else a small fortified city would need. And they're going to build all of this in under 3 hours, before the sun goes down. By dark, walls are up, gates are guarded, and sentries are posted. This wasn't some exceptional display of Roman heroism. This happened every single day, every single night, for months on end, whenever the legions were on campaign. What you're about to witness is one of the most remarkable organizational achievements in human history, and it's called the Roman Castra. Today, we're going to break down exactly how they did it by examining 4 critical pillars: the planning that happened before the army even arrived, the actual construction process, the genius of the internal layout, and finally, why the camp itself was arguably Rome's most powerful weapon. The story of the Roman marching camp actually begins hours before the main army ever shows up, with a small but absolutely essential specialist unit known as the mensores, the surveyors. These weren't ordinary soldiers grabbed at random and handed a measuring stick. They were trained engineers, men who understood terrain, mathematics, and military logistics at a level that most modern armies would envy. While 6,000 soldiers were still breaking down camp and shouldering their packs for the day's march, these surveyors were already moving ahead, scouting the route, and selecting the next campsite. Their job was to transform raw wilderness into a precise blueprint on the ground, ready the moment the column arrived. The mensores worked from a strict 4-point checklist that governed every site selection decision. First and most critically, water. 6,000 men had an enormous daily demand for drinking water alone, not to mention water for cooking, horses, and sanitation. A reliable water source within practical reach was absolutely non-negotiable. Second was ground conditions. The site needed to be flat enough to accommodate the regular street grid that defined every Roman camp, but sloped just enough to ensure proper drainage. Waterlogged ground wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a health disaster waiting to happen, breeding disease and making construction a nightmare. Third came defensibility. The Romans were pragmatists. If they could find a site where 1 or 2 sides were naturally protected by a river, a steep slope, or dense forest, they would select it in a heartbeat, because that meant less perimeter to actively guard with armed sentries. And fourth was fodder. The legion traveled with horses, mules, and cattle that all needed feeding, so grazing land or stored fodder had to be available nearby. Once a suitable site was selected, the mensores went to work with specialized tools. They used measuring rods and ranging poles to mark distances, but their secret weapon was the gramma, a Roman instrument that allowed them to establish perfectly precise right angles even over rough, uneven ground. And here's what made the system truly genius. Every single measurement was completely standardized. The praetorium, the commander's tent, always went in the same position. The Via Principalis, the main street, always ran in the same orientation. The gates always occupied the same relative positions. It didn't matter if the legion was marching through Spain, Gaul, or Syria. The camp layout was identical. This might sound trivial until you consider that an army of 6,000 men spoke multiple languages and dialects, arrived at the site exhausted and disoriented, and had less than 3 hours to transform open ground into a functioning military installation. By standardizing everything down to the last foot, the Romans ensured that every soldier carried the camp layout in his head like a mental map, memorized through endless repetition. By the time the main column crested the hill and saw the site, colored flags and stakes were already marking every zone. Praetorium here, Via Principalis there, unit areas on the flanks, latrines downwind, horse lines along the perimeter. The camp existed as a complete diagram on the ground before a single marching soldier had even entered the site. That level of advanced preparation was absolutely revolutionary. Now let's talk about what happened when those 6,000 exhausted soldiers actually arrived. And this is where the real spectacle unfolds. The moment the horn sounded the halt, there was no rest period, no time to catch one's breath. Soldiers dropped their marching packs and immediately picked up their entrenching tools. Every single Roman soldier carried a construction kit as standard, non-negotiable equipment. This wasn't optional gear stashed in a baggage wagon. It was part of every man's basic load. The dolabra was a combined pickaxe and adze that could break ground, cut through roots, and shape timber. The palo was an iron-shod wooden spade designed to move earth efficiently, and every man also carried rope, stakes, and wicker baskets for hauling excavated soil. They were trained to use these tools with the same precision they applied to their weapons. The labor was organized with military precision down to the smallest unit. Work was divided by centuries and cohorts, with each unit assigned a specific perimeter section or internal task. The centurions directed construction exactly as they directed battle, with absolute authority and immediate correction of any deviation from the standard. And this is crucial to understand. The camp was not built by specialist engineers working separately from the combat troops. It was built by the soldiers themselves, the same men who would be fighting in those defenses that very night if necessary. The first priority was always the fossa, the defensive ditch, which ran around the entire perimeter of the camp. This was typically V-shaped, about 3 Roman feet deep and 9 feet wide, but these dimensions scaled depending on threat level. In quiet territory, a smaller ditch sufficed. When enemies were known to be nearby, the Romans would dig 2 parallel ditches and make them considerably deeper. From the earth they excavated, they built the agger, the rampart, piled up on the inner edge of the ditch. Then every soldier drove his pila muralia, the sharpened wooden stakes he carried, into the crest of this rampart, creating a deadly palisade. The combined fossa and agger formed a barrier specifically designed to stop a cavalry charge in its tracks and slow any attacking infantry long enough for defenders to respond with deadly effect. While perimeter work continued at full speed, other details were simultaneously tackling internal construction. Some units were laying out the internal street grid with mathematical precision. Others were pitching leather tents in their assigned positions. Teams were digging latrines downwind of sleeping areas, establishing horse lines, and setting up the Praetorium command area with everything the legate needed to conduct business. How did this coordination actually work? Because every man knew his role, his position, and his specific task before he ever arrived at the site. The standardized layout meant zero on-site decisions were needed. This was pure execution. No improvisation, no confusion, no time wasted figuring out what to do next. When the camp was complete, its internal organization was a masterpiece of functional design. The street system was built around two main thoroughfares. The Via Principalis was the main street, running the full width of the camp and wide enough to accommodate troops in formation moving rapidly. This wasn't just for convenience. It meant the army could deploy through the gates quickly in emergencies. Running perpendicular to it was the Via Praetoria, creating the distinctive cross-shaped street plan that defined the internal organization of every Roman camp. At the center of the Via Principalis stood the Praetorium, the commander's tent and administrative heart of the installation. This was where the legate received reports, issued orders, and conducted the business of command. It was surrounded by the tents of senior tribunes and the aquilifer, the soldier who carried the eagle's standard, the spiritual and symbolic heart of the entire legion. Around this central axis, unit areas were arranged in standardized blocks on either side of the streets. Each century occupied an identical plot, and leather tents were pitched in exactly the same configuration every single night. Camp after camp, campaign after campaign. The camp had 4 gates, positioned at the cardinal points. The Porta Praetoria faced the front, toward the enemy. The Porta Decumana faced the rear, and the 2 Porta Principalis gates occupied the left and right flanks. These gates were tactical assets, not just entrances. They were wide enough to allow the army to sort rapidly and deploy through them at speed, wide enough for supply convoys to enter and patrol groups to exit in force. Each gate was guarded all night by a dedicated watch, and the tesserae, the daily password, was changed every single day to prevent any possibility of infiltration. The internal logic of the camp's layout followed the same principle as its external defenses. Eliminate uncertainty, reduce decision time, enable rapid response. A soldier woken at midnight by a sudden alarm would know instantly which gate to move toward, where his century forms up, and exactly what his role was in the defensive plan. The geography of the camp was his training. He didn't need to think about it. His body already knew. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because the camp wasn't just a place to sleep safely. It was a weapon in its own right, a strategic asset that transformed how the Romans conducted warfare. An army that could fortify every single night couldn't be surprised. It couldn't be destroyed by a dawn attack while sleeping. It could choose when to fight and when to withdraw, knowing it always had a defensible position to return to. The enemy faced an impossible dilemma: attack the fortified camp and face prepared defenses on difficult terrain, or watch the Romans operate from a secure base indefinitely, day after day, week after week. This was strategic paralysis inflicted on the enemy through simple, relentless discipline. Julius Caesar was the absolute master practitioner of this system during his Gallic campaigns. When he was outnumbered, he fortified and waited. When enemies came to him, they faced prepared defenses on his terms. When he was on the move, each night's camp erased the vulnerability of the march. But beyond the tactical advantages, there was a profound psychological dimension to the operation. Building a fort every evening and demolishing it every morning sent an unmistakable message to Gallic tribes and every other enemy Rome faced. This is not a raiding party that came and will leave. This force is organized. It will be back tomorrow. The Castra was a statement of permanence in motion, a declaration that Rome had arrived and was not going anywhere. When morning came, the Romans tore it all down. The breakdown followed a precise 3-signal sequence. The first trumpet, the classicum, woke the soldiers. They struck their tents, packed their equipment, and prepared to move. The second signal meant horses were saddled and baggage was loaded onto the mules. The third signal told the column to form up and begin the march. Before departing, everything was demolished systematically. The Pila Morilia stakes were pulled from the rampart and repacked into soldiers' loads. They would need them again that very night. Leather tents were folded and loaded. Latrines were filled in and covered. Nothing was left to chance. An abandoned camp wasn't just wasted space. It was a liability. An enemy force could shelter in it. An ambush could be staged against the departing column using the camp's infrastructure. Roman doctrine was absolute. Leave nothing useful behind. But the earth remembers. Archaeologists have found the rectangular depressions and compressed ground traces of Roman marching camps scattered across 3 continents, from Scotland to Romania. Each depression marks the negative space of a fosse dug, and then deliberately filled back in. Each strip of compressed ground marks a via principalis where thousands of feet walked in formation. These footprints, found on sites across the ancient world, represent the most durable monument to the most disciplined army the ancient world ever produced. Think about that for a moment. 3 hours of construction every evening, for months at a time, year after year, campaign after campaign. The marching camp was not just an engineering achievement, it was a psychological one. The discipline to take exhausted soldiers and immediately set them to precise, heavy labor was the exact same discipline that made the Roman army effective in battle. The camp and the legion were expressions of the same fundamental principle, transforming individual men into a collective machine that was infinitely greater than the sum of its parts. A single Roman soldier was a capable fighter, but 6,000 Roman soldiers who could build a fortified city in 3 hours after a 20-mile march? That was something their enemies had no answer for. The Castra was Rome's signature. Wherever the legions marched, the rectangular earthworks followed. The message it sent was simple, unmistakable, and absolutely terrifying. Rome is here. Rome is organized. And Rome is not leaving until it chooses to.
Halt! Remove packs! No rest! You're paid and pickaxe! Faster, you dogs! The ramparts must stand by dawn! Yes. Dig deeper! No slacking! Legionaries! The ramparts must rise by dusk! Yes.